Hello. Hi, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Bonjour, je m'appelle Paul Lefurdo et je suis coordonnateur pour ArtSpeaks. Et je vous souhaite tous la bienvenue à cette prochaine conférence, donc la conférence Horizon mouvant, art et technologie. Before proceeding with tonight's talk, ArtSpeaks wishes to acknowledge that we are located on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. Tiohtià:ke, aussi appelé Muniang et Montréal, est un endroit de rassemblement pour nombreux peuples autochtones depuis des milliers d'années. Aujourd'hui, ces terres accueillent aussi une population diverse de peuples autochtones et d'autres personnes. Nous reconnaissons aussi les Kanien'kehá:ka en tant que les gardiens et gardiennes traditionnels des terres sur lesquelles nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui. Nous sommes très reconnaissants de pouvoir se réunir ensemble avec vous aujourd'hui. ArtSpeaks respects the continued connections between the present, the past, and the future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples. And we recognize our position as settlers on the lands, and we're grateful to be able to gather here today with all of you. Bienvenue à cette conférence ArtSpeaks, une conférence avec Tina Rivers-Ryan et Trevor Paglen. Et d'ailleurs, la première conférence qu'on organise cette année dans le cadre de notre 10e anniversaire. Donc, on est particulièrement content de pouvoir être avec vous ce soir pour commencer les célébrations de notre 10e anniversaire. Merci. Just to let you know as well, tonight's talk will also be recorded, so you'll be able to access that on our archive through our YouTube channel as well as our website, which is brand new for the 10th anniversary as well, so please go take a look. Some little housekeeping notes as well. Please make sure to have your cell phones on silent mode for the talk. But feel free to take some photographs, and you can also tag us on Instagram at ArtSpeaksMTL. Just to give you an idea of the structure of tonight's talk, we're going to have about an hour and a quarter with Tina and Trevor, and then we're going to have around 15 or 20 minutes of question period at the end. So please do keep your questions in your head, and then we'll be able to start passing around some microphones. Myself and a colleague will be passing those around for you. And just make sure you keep your questions short so the maximum amount of people can engage with Tina and Trevor. And lastly, to introduce Tina and Trevor, please welcome the founder of ArtSpeaks, Lillian Maurer.
Thank you so much. Oh, the light is very bright. I'm delighted to see this big crowd, although I can't see you at all now. But thank you for coming. ArtSpeaks is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year, as Paul said. I must say that my dream of creating conversations through the arts has given me tremendous satisfaction and joy. I hope you too have been struck by the power of the voices we have been lucky enough to hear from. From Tal Lewis's raw emotion, to Jason Farago's dizzying brilliance, to Thelma Golden's generous inspiration, and Helen Molesworth's intense humanity, to name just a few of our speakers. ArtSpeaks strives to bring voices at the forefront of the arts to Montreal to celebrate new perspectives and insights. Tonight will be no different. In 1946, the University of Pennsylvania presented the world's first digital computer. It filled an entire room. 5 years later, the first commercial digital computer was patented. Artists immediately saw the creative potential of electronic control systems and began experimenting with cybernetic art, as it was then called. Today, digital technologies have infiltrated almost all aspects of art making. We are so fortunate tonight to hear from Tina Rivers-Ryan, I can't see you, and Trevor Paglen, two of the leading voices in this conversation, who are both uniquely able to guide us through this moment. Tina, as an art historian and a PhD in media art, and years of curatorial and research work in the field. And Trevor Paglen, who works with photography and technology to bring our attention to how the dynamics of surveillance are shaping our image culture. Tina Rivers-Ryan holds 3 degrees. 3 degrees in art history and a PhD from Columbia University. She was chief curator at Buffalo AKG Museum from 2017 to 2024. before becoming editor-in-chief at Art Forum. Tina is one of the leading art historians specializing in art from 1960, with her expertise in media art, including video, digital, and internet art. She has written and spoken extensively on the subject. She received the Award for Excellence from the Association of Art Museum Curators in 2022, and in the same year, she received the Andy Warhol Foundation Art Writers Grant. Trevor Paglen has an MFA from the Art Institute of Chicago and a PhD in geography from the History of California, Berkeley. Trevor's work is internationally recognized, and he's had major exhibitions at the Vienna Secession, the Smithsonian, Fondation Prada, amongst many others. In 2016, Trevor won the Deutsche Borst Photography Foundation Prize, and in 2017, he was the recipient of a prestigious MacArthur Fellowship. His rigorous practice spans photography, sculpture, video, and installation, and he is known for his investigation of invisible phenomena and forces. Through his work, Trevor has explored AI surveillance, data collection, and militarism in America. His practice seeks to merge the boundaries of art, science, and investigative journalism. On a local note, Trevor's work is no stranger to Montreal. Trevor showed at Mois de la Photo in 2013, and in 2018, the Max Collectors Symposium purchased one of his works for their collection. Tina, too, has a strong connection to Quebec, and she loves it here. So please, without further ado, welcome Tina and Trevor to the stage.
Good evening. There we go. Good evening, everyone. I'm Tina Rivers-Ryan. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
So great to be here with you.
So great to be here with you.
Thank you all for coming. I'm so happy to be here in Montreal with you guys.
Yeah. So Trevor and I are really excited to have a sort of joint presentation this evening about art and technology really broadly. The way we're going to conduct this is I have a few general remarks about the state of art and technology as a field of contemporary art, and then I'm going to hand it over to Trevor, who's going to give, you guys are very lucky for this, you're in for a treat, a short presentation about specifically his work with AI, which I think is probably the area of art and technology that is getting a lot of attention right now, and also is the subject of a lot of confusion and a lot of consternation. So Trevor's going to talk about his practice, and then after that, we're going to have a conversation between the two of us about some of the thematics, questions, et cetera, that are going to be raised by Trevor in talking about his work. Yeah, and then we'll go on from there. And just to say, because I know Lillian said something, but thank you so much to Lillian and Paul, by the way, for the invitation and for all of your excellent work in organizing this. And as far as my relationship to Quebec, I have a deep history here with my family. We have spent every single New Year's welcoming in the new year here in Quebec province for the past 20 years. So. In addition to being invited to lecture at UQAM, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and Concordia and all of that. So it's an incredible art scene in Montreal. Montreal is a great town for those of us who love media art. It's an incredible community here. I know some of you are here in the audience, so some of you might be quite familiar with what we're going to talk about, but Trevor and I also understand that for others of you, this material might be quite unfamiliar, so we're going to try to bring you along in the conversation. But again, if you have any questions, we'll do the Q&A at the end. Great. So art and technology, one of the reasons we have to narrow it down and really focus this conversation, I think, today about AI is that it's an enormous field. Art and technology is a term that it can encompass mechanical robots, video art, work with AI, internet-based art, NFTs, blockchain. I mean, there's a lot in that field. And I'm one of those people who has argued that actually the history of art and technology really vastly precedes what we think of as sort of the age of the digital revolution from the 1990s onwards, that it goes back to the 1700s, one could even say, with things like the Fontaine Lumineuse. But what we're sort of seeing with art and technology, I think, most recently in contemporary art, so it's sort of art being made with technology has been happening for a very long time. A lot of attention has been paid to art and technology, let's say over the past 20 years or so, different fads. So there, has been a sort of video art fad, a projected image, sort of film fad, augmented reality, virtual reality, NFTs, and now AI. So there's been these different kind of movements within art and technology that have captured the imagination of the field of contemporary art. Much more recently, so basically I'm talking about 2024 and 2025, a lot of people have started paying attention to that longer history, so not just thinking about blockchain, NFTs, AR, VR, but really going back to, let's say, the 1960s. And so there were a number of exhibitions that did this work, and I'm just going to briefly introduce you to some of them. So there was the Electric Dreams exhibition at the Tate Modern, which was a massive survey show talking about various aspects of art and technology on a global scale. The exhibition Radical Software, Women, Art, and Computing, which originated at the Kunsthalle Wien, focused specifically on women working with specifically computers in those decades of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And this was a very important show. Full disclosure, I contributed to the catalog for this show. I also contributed to the catalog for the show at the Tate Modern. But these curators who organize these exhibitions were doing fantastic work. Another exhibition at the MCA Chicago, The Living End, Painting and Other Technologies. Again, looking at this moment that goes back, as far back as, let's say, the 1970s, maybe even the 60s, I don't quite recall. But this show did something else that I think has been important in recent discourse about art and technology, which is to really question what we mean when we say technology. And so in focusing on, you see the title here, painting as itself a technology, and looking at how artists have worked with painting as a way of exploring these electronic technologies like television and computers, really opened up that conversation, which is something else that's very important to me and other people who are, have been working with media art in the past few years. And then finally, there is the exhibition that I curated. So all of these shows were the fall of 2024. It was really like a banner moment. I curated an exhibition called Electric Op at the Buffalo AKG Art Museum, which looked at the history of art and technology from the 1960s right up until the present, focusing on this idea of abstraction, of geometric abstraction as a visual language that has been developed across painting and sculpture and video and computer art. So that is my very brief introduction to the state of the field, because I know this talk was titled Shifting Horizons, to art and technology. So there is this impulse now to look back towards the past to try to sort of discover maybe how we got to this moment right now. But the other impulse that I think we're seeing a lot, as I mentioned, is this fascination with AI, and with thinking about the aesthetics of AI, thinking about AI as a technology, trying to use art to understand how AI works, to raise some questions about the political or ecological dimensions of AI. This work has been going on for a few years now, so I'm just mentioning one of the many, many, many exhibitions that we've seen about AI. This was the Uncanny Valley, Being Human in the Age of AI at the De Young Museum in San Francisco. And I'm showing an installation of Trevor's work in that show, which he will come back to and talk about again. But again, starting around fall 2024 up until the end of last year, there were a number of exhibitions that happened at the Pompidou Centre, for example, in Paris, but elsewhere, many exhibitions about AI. So to sort of briefly plug, something that we've been doing at Art Forum of late has been to try to advance a conversation about AI in a way that maybe moves beyond some of what have calcified into the more obvious talking points. Sometimes this work takes the form of straightforward reviews. So this is a screenshot of a review of one of these many shows about AI. This one happened in New York, Symbiosis, Art in the Age of AI. We've also been publishing long-form essays that attempt to help us think about the work that AI does in a more historical or theoretical way. A lot of the conversation has been driven by the technology. It's, we spend a lot of time explaining, what generative AI is, how a GAN works, et cetera, et cetera. And when I say we, I mean, curators, academics, artists, et cetera. And so at Art Forum, we thought one thing that we could do was to sort of host conversations that aren't so much just about how the technology works, but maybe how it relates to art history, frankly. And so here's an essay we published by Mario Carpo, who's an architectural historian, on the relationship to mannerism, that generative AI sort of, I'm not even going to attempt to explain his argument. I just really encourage, if any of you are interested in AI, that you go and check that out. We also published, and I do love this title. I can't remember who came up with it. Our editorial meetings are pretty intense, and there's a lot of generative thinking. But this fantastic essay by Sonia Drimmer called Machine Yearning. This was sort of a meta essay about all of the essays about AI, and even more specifically looking at how the way we talk about AI is couched so much in this kind of language that is very, what's the word I want to say? Not quite optimistic, but that is that there's a lot of language around AI that presumes that AI is very powerful and is doing really incredible things, and a lot of that language is produced by the companies that are making AI and trying to raise venture funds to fund themselves. And so this essay is taking a step back to look at that language around how we talk about AI, and to sort of question, why we have this kind of investment in it. Most recently, literally last week, we published a video with an amazing artist named Trevor Paglen, in which he talks about not specifically his work with AI, but in general, his influences, the things that he's looking at. One thing that was very illuminating for me was you mentioning Hans Haacke as an influence. So again, attempting to take this conversation around AI and situate it not just in the space of technology, but in the space of art and art history, right? To say that, well, maybe there's something about Trevor's work that actually relates to these other questions that have been asked by artists who are post-minimalist or performing institutional critique, right? Which personally is somebody, who is very bad at math and doesn't necessarily want to always get dragged into the details about these technologies. It's nice to sort of be able to connect it back to something that at least is my comfort zone, which is the history of images. So now I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Trevor and let him walk us through a little bit. I've been saying AI a lot, and I know we may not necessarily even all think that means the same thing. So Trevor, I'm going to let you take it over, and then we'll talk more.
Is the microphone on? Okay, here we are. Thank you guys so much for having me today. I think what I'll do is just try to blaze through about 15 years of projects. And the provocation I want to start with is, thinking about the history of images, right? And I think about, I feel like my job as an artist is to try to understand how we see the world around us. And a big way that we do that is through the use of images, artworks, visual culture, what have you. And I want to set out a provocation tonight, which is that I think we're in the middle of two great revolutions in terms of our relationship to images and visuality, right? Revolutions that are as significant as, for example, the invention of perspective, or as significant as the invention of photography. And it's a scary moment that we're living in, obviously, but it is quite remarkable that we find ourselves in the middle of a couple of these things. And those two revolutions, I think I would describe as one as being the advent of computer vision, and then two, the advent of generative AI. And these are both things that I've done a lot of different projects about. So I want to go through, those two different threads or those two different revolutions. So we can start with computer vision, right? So people had been trying to figure out how to get computers to like see the world and understand something about it, going back to the 1960s. But it was really hacky and it never quite worked. But in the late 2000s, early 2010s, that started to change, and it did started to work. A lot of it had to do with the work of Alex Krichevsky, who was working in Jeff Hinton's lab at the University of Toronto. So there's a Canada connection there, who kind of famously made the first neural network called AlexNet that actually worked and showed that neural networks were a way of doing computer vision in a way that was far more robust than the older techniques. So sitting here today, I think a lot of us don't realize the extent to which computer vision has transformed our everyday lives. And a lot of that is because it's transformed our lives in ways that are not necessarily always obvious, right? So in cities, we have computer vision systems that track cars, that track human figures, that track people's faces. They can automate low-level policing. And in the workplace, you have systems that kind of can micro-monitor every conceivable gesture, your time at desk, where are your eyes looking, what's your posture like? And we don't even need to get into the crazy stuff that goes on in like fulfillment centers and that kind of thing, or in trucking. In your home, if you have a smart TV, there's a good chance that TV is taking a snapshot of everything that you watch and sending that off to advertising companies or data brokerage companies. Your fridge might be aware of what's inside of it. Online platforms can like scan your vacation photos and your family portraits for any commodities you might be interested in. Are you a Coke person? Are you a Pepsi person? Is there evidence in your Facebook profile that you're obese or that you smoke or that you have risky hobbies that can be extracted from that and then sent to insurance companies or employers, for example? And so this kind of thing goes on and on and on. And I don't think that we've really collectively recognized how transformative that's been, because a lot of it's on the back end. We don't really see it. So in the early 2010s, I kind of saw this stuff coming, and I was really interested in, and was like, wow, there's this thing that's starting to happen where computers can actually look at stuff and start to make sense of it. And I wanted to work with that. I wanted to understand that. And the main, kind of the central question that was guiding my work on computer vision was, how do machines see? Right? So there's a lot of ways that you can ask that question, a lot of different things that you can mean by that question. But I wanted to explore that question in every way that I could. How do machines see, and how is that different than maybe the ways that humans see? So there's a lot of sub-questions within that. Like first, you have a kind of formal sub-question. In other words, literally, what kind of formal abstractions are made by different computer vision algorithms, right? Is a self-driving car looking for the edges of the street? It's abstracting that street into two lines. Maybe one is looking for street signs, so it's looking for circles and then trying to interpret what those circles are. So there's a kind of formal physics of vision built into different computer vision algorithms. So I started doing things like hooking up computer vision systems that were designed for a self-driving car and tell it, okay, we're going to look at this cloud formation. And the system kind of freaks out because it's not designed to do that. But it starts to hallucinate kind of all kinds of patterns in the clouds. But this question of seeing gets more complicated. So I'm going to ask a second formal question, which is, what are the, almost like the underlying forms built into computer vision systems? So for example, if you want to do face detection or face recognition, the algorithm that you create has to have some kind of a concept of what a face is, right? It has to figure out, here's a mathematical version of the face, and it has to the pattern has to have these qualities and not these other qualities. So you have this kind of Platonic form of a face built into the algorithm. So I started going through the history of face recognition and trying to recover these, trying to basically pull apart the algorithms and try to understand what are the faces, what are the normative ideas of faces or heads that are built into them. One of them was the first facial recognition system was built, by a guy named Woody Bledsoe for the CIA, weirdly, in the 1960s. And this is a reconstruction of his, what he called the standard face, his, and so it was, he had scanned people's faces, turned them into an algorithm. I reverse engineered the algorithm and like turned it into a bust. And I was thinking a lot about, in a way, these are kind of like our Platonic forms. This is like our version of like Greek sculpture of like the ideal body and that kind of thing. But obviously it's all mathematized, quantified, whatever you want to say it. But it lives in algorithms. And so I've reconstructed a lot of these different archetypes from different approaches to things like face detection and face recognition. And what I started doing then was, building out software that would allow me to probe computer vision systems in different kind of ways. One of the things that we built was a system that would allow us to train a face recognition on somebody and then reconstruct almost like the ideal type of that particular person's face, kind of almost like recovering these kind of ghostly portraitures from these very technical systems. So we did one for Frantz Fanon, for Simone Weil, for any host of people. And there's technical reasons why they look like fuzzy that are kind of interesting, but we won't go into that. And then I started applying that to objects, trying to find these Platonic forms of objects that different classification systems have been trained on. So this, for example, is like the sun, as understood by a particular kind of classifier. And some of these artifacts get even more abstract, right? So you can, AI models are famously like black boxes that are like you can't see into it, and stuff comes in and stuff goes out, and nobody knows what goes on in the middle. So we started building probes to go into those layers of the machine learning algorithms and try to find specific places in what's called the latent space and synthesize images from that. So we were trying to see the images that a machine learning algorithm was making for itself in order to try to understand images in general. So we have these, this set of formal concerns, but now we also have other concerns as well, like political ones or historical ones, and kind of thinking about what are the histories in which these ways of seeing are embedded, right? And I was thinking a lot about 19th century, what we might call frontier photography, looking particularly at photographers that were working in the Western United States in the immediate aftermath of the Mexican-American War, where the U.S. claimed all this territory and it didn't know what to do with it, didn't know what it looked like. It was all, unmapped, by white people, basically. And so they sent these photographers out to do these survey photographs. And I thought about, that relationship to the land, of trying to capture the land through the creation of images of it, as being, kind of akin to what, a computer vision algorithm does. So I was going back and finding these sites of like these iconic survey photographs and rephotographing them and then running them through computer vision systems. So we have a third question, which is that when you look at contemporary computer vision systems, they're all made out of substrates of labeled data, right? And so what you do is you get together a whole bunch of images and you say, these are oranges and these are apples and these are cats and these are dogs, and you use those images to train the machine learning model how to differentiate one object from another. And I wanted to look at that history, and I wanted to look at those photographs that had been taken and labeled in particular ways and just try to understand that. So see, these are some of the first data sets that were made for training face detection. These are from the 90s, and in the 90s, you didn't have Facebook, you didn't have Instagram. So if you needed a bunch of faces to teach computers how to see faces, where are you gonna get those faces from? Well, one way you do it, if you're the military, is you go to military bases and you force, people to have their pictures taken, and you create a data set that way. There's another source of images, though, that has lots of faces in the 1990s, and that, of course, is the police, right? So they went to the FBI and collected thousands of pictures of prisoners, and these became the kind of one of these forms of these faces that were used to train some of the early algorithms. And this gets quite gnarly, actually. This is rough stuff. And as these the ambitions of people developing these kinds of algorithms grew and grew, they started trying to make data sets that would help you detect people's like inner emotional states and that kind of thing, doing this silly stuff like this. And so, you get into this question of labeling images, right? So you have a bunch of images and you have to say what they are. You have to say, this is an orange, this is an apple, this is a cat, this is a dog. And that might seem straightforward, but what does it mean to label an image? Like, what does it mean to look at something like this and the computer vision systems that's been taught to recognize objects say, well, this is obviously an apple, case closed, right? I'm just pointing out that there's like a kind of some metaphysical subtleties, as we might call them here. These are examples of one of the most widely used of these training sets for object detection, something called ImageNet, that was created between 2009 and 2011. And here you go, your apples, your bananas, your dogs, and that sort of thing. But this is another classifier trained on that database. And you have some straightforward stuff here, furniture, chair, black tie. But then you got this other weird stuff. Person, okay. Leader, what's that? Worker, what's that? Worker is not the same kind of a noun as apple is, right? And so what I'm getting at is that this business about taking pictures and labeling them can get weird. And it can get really gross, and it can get really fucked, honestly, when you start labeling people. And so I was working with this data set a lot, and I was like horrified at all this stuff that was in here, because this was going into production systems. Nobody knew where this stuff was going. It was getting built into all kinds of things. And so I made this application where I took all of the people in this data set, I trained a classifier on it, and I made a little web app where you could take your picture and upload it, and it would tell you how an algorithm trained on this data set would classify you. I've never been married, but there you have it. And this turned into one of these internet things, and everybody went crazy with it. And I really, pissed off a lot of people in the computer science industry. But it was a tricky project, because it's the kind of project you make something that you don't want to exist for the purpose of showing that it does exist. I don't recommend doing that as an artist. It was only up for about 2 weeks. But it sort of lives on as this interactive installation now it's currently up in Mexico City, and there's a version of it on buildings and stuff like that. But on the one that we show now, we toned it down a lot, so it's not so like insanely offensive. It's just like gently offensive. But I was thinking about this question of what does it mean to say this is an orange, that's an apple, that's a banana, what have you? And I thought this is such a crude way of thinking about our relationship to images. If you look at a Renaissance painting and there's some guy in a robe holding an orange, it's not about him being oh, I like eating oranges or whatever, right? So much of the way that we use images and think through them is using allegory, using metaphors, using meanings that we attach to them, that sort of thing. And so I was I want to make my own classifiers that are just based on weird stuff, right? What if you were a classifier, but the only thing that you were trained on was images from Freudian psychoanalysis? What would you see when you looked out at the world? Maybe you would see a mother and a mirror and false teeth and all these weird Freudian images that are relevant to the interpretation of dreams. So I started building classifiers based on literature, based on poetry, based on allegory. And started building stuff like this, where now you'd build a classifier and looked around the room. This was a model that I called Monsters of Capitalism. So it was a model that would interpret everything as if it were a monster that has historically been used as an allegory for a moment in a circle of capital. So it would say it would see a vampire, sucking the blood of the working class, or see a zombie, mindlessly consuming, what have you. And I started thinking about these models as themselves as kind of artworks. Now, I was reading a lot of the kind of technical papers that were coming out at that time. And there's a guy named Ian Goodfellow here at the University of Montreal, and he showed something crazy, which is that you could build a classifier like this, right? He's but you can flip it around. He's what if you flipped it around, instead of asking the computer to interpret something as a vampire, you used it to draw a picture of a vampire, right? And you basically run the neural net backwards. That's not exactly what's going on technically, but I'm trying to make it just accessible. But you can basically induce these things to make images. So that was done by Ian Goodfellow here at University of Montreal. Another Canada moment here. And I started using the technique he'd published to make these kind of crude images. This is a man, this is the Tower of Babel. This is a pair of eyes. Now, this is one of the many moments in my career where if I had started a company, I would just be a billionaire instead of making a dozen prints and then getting bored and moving on to the next thing. But this speaks to what we now would call maybe the generative turn in AI, this move towards making AI models that don't just interpret the world, but actually make images for us, make texts for us. And we're living in a world now where, AI is everywhere. We live in a kind of torrent of recommendation algorithms, of AI curated feeds. We live in an attention economy, a kind of engagement economy. We live in a world of GPTs and AI slop and all of the rest. And we're starting to find ourselves in a world where texts don't necessarily have authors, where photographs don't necessarily come from cameras, and where images don't necessarily come from artists. And all of these media are increasingly sort of designed to sculpt our experience of reality in order to extract some kind of value from that experience, either through controlling our attention or trying to shape our beliefs or what have you. Now, when people talk about generative AI, they tend to talk about what they call the hallucination problem, right? And this is the idea that AI systems have a tendency just to make shit up, right? And they do. But I'm less interested in that, and I'm more interested in the other hallucination problem, which is how AI makes us hallucinate, right? And there's some incredibly dangerous shit going on in relation to this stuff right now, as you and I well know, based on where I am from. So I've been really seriously trying to understand forms of media that are designed to mess with our sense of reality, right? Forms of media that aren't really about representation or storytelling, but that are meant to target much lower areas of our cognitive stack. I think a lot about why the hell do I want to look at a 20-second video of somebody eating spaghetti messily? What is that? I don't even there's something there's neurologically something going on that I don't understand why I'm even looking at this crap. It makes no sense. It's totally unreasonable, right? And so I've started to think about this stuff as weird media. And I think there's a lot of forms of this, of weird media, the media that is trying to speak to your lizard brain. Basically, you can kind of think about it that way, low levels of your cognitive stack. One form of weird media is stage magic, right? So the stage magic being the art of making you experience reality in ways that are different from what reality actually is, right? Messing with your perception, kind of. One of the other forms of what I think of as weird media comes from military psyops. So I made this film with this guy named Rick Doty, he did psyops for the Air Force in the 70s and 80s, and he conjured this. He was working at this military base where they're doing all these secret technology projects, and he started inventing stories about UFOs in order to get people to believe that they were working on UFOs rather than secret military stuff. So it just made everybody seem crazy. And one of the people he did this to actually did go crazy and ended up hospitalized. Weirdly, I've had a collection of UFO photos from just my weird travels. I've spent a lot of time in the desert, a lot of time around weird places, and sometimes you see weird stuff in the sky, or sometimes you see conventional things in the sky that I know if I photograph in a particular way, it'll look like something weird. And so I've had this weird collection of photos, and 10 years ago, if you would have said oh, show me those UFO photos, I was that'll be the day that I'm done. I'm checking out as an artist the second I show these to anybody. But then now, nothing's real anymore, and I was just okay, fuck it. It's time to show these UFO photos. So I've been rabbit holing on this for a while. Did this show in 2023 called You've Just Been Fucked by Psyops, much to the chagrin of the marketing team at Pace Gallery. And we did this other one of UFO photographs called Cardinals. Now, there's all kinds of media protocols that are designed to speak to your subconscious, right? Another one of these weird media might be like hypnotism, right? I'm working on a piece right now for Venice that basically hypnotizes you. You go into this installation, and it hypnotizes you and takes you on a series of these mental journeys. And again, and I want to approach this question of trying to understand this space of weird images from as many ways as I can. And so some of that involves working with AI, but working with AI in a really different way than like, make me a picture of a teddy bear on the moon or what have you, right? Like not really using generators in that way. I've been super obsessed with this scientific paper, this neural population control via deep image synthesis. This is a guy, another Canada appearance here. This guy's a professor at McGill, Puya Bashavan. One of his postdoc graduate students is there in the audience, Lucas. And so we've been working together trying to explore this stuff. Now, what Puya did, which was really crazy, is he would put a chip in a monkey's brain and show the monkey a bunch of images and map what kinds of neurological activities those generated images made. And then he built a model of the monkey's brain's response and then created an AI image generator where it would like constantly generate images, and then he could look at where in the brain what neurons in the brain those images were activating. And he kind of figured out a way to control what neurons were firing in the monkey's brains as a way to like turn things on and also turn things off. And then when he found a particular neuron that he could activate, he could use these image generators to generate images that would activate that neuron in ways much, much more intensely than anything that would happen in nature. And so he's like literally trying to find these weird images that do weird subconscious stuff to the brains of monkeys. So I wanted to do this to myself. So I've been spending a lot of time in fMRI machines doing these kind of like Clockwork Orange kind of experiments where you lie in there and you look at thousands of images and they measure all the neurons that are firing in your brain, and then you try to build a model on that will predict how your brain responds to that, and then trying to find an image generator to stimulate your brain in these intense ways. Internally in my studio, this is unofficially known as the Monkey Doritos Project. and it's called that because Doritos are not food, right? Doritos are triangle-shaped psyops that are designed to maximally stimulate your sense of taste, your sense of smell, that sort of thing, right? And I'll eat the whole bag. I mean, you eat the whole bag. They're designed to do that. Like it's a weird media form, right? So we're just starting to figure out some of this stuff. Very brief glimpse into one of those images, but I will bring it back from there.
There we go. I told you were in for a treat. Where to begin? Okay, I have a couple thoughts that came out of that. So, but we're just going to see where the conversation takes us. The first one I want to put on the table is to follow up on what you were alluding to in talking about the UFO images and showing the Trump deepfake images that now even in the US are subject to a president who is promoting false images, and now we've seen our US government is actually doctoring images and releasing them from like the official White House press account and things like that. So we are definitely, we've passed the Rubicon into this brave new world, right? Where we are going through what I've been thinking of as a kind of epistemological crisis. I don't know if any of you guys remember watching the Colbert Report with Stephen Colbert back in the day, but he introduced this word truthiness, which then became like the word of the year. I forget what year that was, but this was a while ago, and now with AI-generated deepfakes, we've entered a sort of much deeper level of truthiness, where things, there's a sort of a statistical likelihood of plausibility, which is fundamentally what AI is about. It's about probability and figuring out the likelihood that something is something or is not something else. And we, it turns out, are, I think, not that much better than machines at detecting, right, images that are plausible or not, in part because these images are being, used deliberately to deceive and are being promoted at this point in our country, but are being shared by the very people who occupy a position of intense authority and who are supposed to be trusted, right? In the December issue of Art Forum, basically I have been very anxious about this coming crisis for a long time, that we already, thanks to algorithms, saw the development on social media of filter bubbles, where my news is not your news, my understanding of the facts is different than your understanding of the facts, because it's not like it used to be where we're all watching Walter Cronkite and we're all getting the same information about what's going on in Vietnam, because there's like 3 channels and it is what it is or whatever, but where now we each have our own little information circles. But now it's like a whole nother thing where it's not even just different information circles. It's like we don't even know what's true or not true anymore. So in the December issue of Art Forum, we commissioned an essay from the writer Hari Kanzru, and it's called Sloppocalypse Now. And I very much appreciate that he explicitly put on the table here that the generation of AI deepfakes is a form of censorship. And the logic there is that the more slop that is produced, the higher the cost to the consumer, the citizen, the voter, to discern the slop from the real, right?
Flood the zone.
Flood the zone, exactly. He even mentions, right, this and I know you guys have worked together, but the idea of, you gotta flood the zone, right, so that basically people either tune out or are easily duped. What does this have to do with art? So I guess one question I have is, one thing that I want to hold on to for artists is that they are the magicians in our society. They are the people who have sort of like the court jester, like they are allowed to say and do things, maybe, including imagine new things, bring things into being that are not reality, right? And I think that's a really important part of, I don't want to be prescriptive. Art can be many things. There are many different kinds of ways of making art, but that's one of the important things that art can do, right? Yeah. So this is maybe too much of a question to put on one artist, but what does it mean to be an artist, to exercise the power of making your own reality when you're living in a reality in which everyone's ability to make their own reality now is extremely politicized and super problematic?
No, this is you nailed it. I think it's not just a epistemological crisis. That's the big one, the level of society. But for a lot of artists that I talk to, where there is this kind of existential thing, what are we doing? You know what I mean? Because you're right. Historically, one of the strategies I've used a lot is let's take this thing, push it as far over here as you can, and then from that vantage point, you can kind of see the normal version of it in a different way, right? Magritte was doing that. That's like strategy as old as time, right? But when you push that world, that fiction already to the point where that is the dominant visual language. First of all, I do think you get there is a kind of neo-fascism that is, that is the political form of that, because you have, I think the theory of democracy relies on the idea of a shared truth, right? That's one of the, and then you deliberate what to do about it, right? Moynihan famously said, in a democracy, you get the right to your own opinion, but not your own facts, right? And so, what do you do about that? I don't know, right? I think that as an artist, my strategy is to probe that. What are the physics of that reality make, of that world building? Why is the Trump thing happening? Why are people reacting to it? Why am I looking at the picture of the person eating spaghetti, right? Or the short video of that. And that's kind of been my approach to it, is to try to understand those ambiguities, try to understand what these kinds of images are doing to me. And that's a place to start, I guess. Part 2 is to connect that to other techniques, whether that's magic or psyops or hypnosis or whatever it is, to try to almost use an irrational means to kind of create a layer of meta-rationality, right? In other words, like, can you, like, by working through these different things, like understanding how they work, working with them, can you arrive at a place where you get a better sense of how different media forms manipulate you, right? And ultimately kind of create intellectual self-defense. Now, who knows whether that works or not, but I feel like ultimately the job of my job is to just try to explore the image space of the present and explore the sensorium of the present, and not necessarily try to make sense of it, but try to ask sharper questions.
Yeah, I mean, following up on that, I love that you are going deep on this like weird history of media imagery, thinking about even the kind of like supernatural or unexplained phenomena. Electronic media have long been associated with, I mean, even just straight up the paranormal, right? So there's like a great book called Haunted Media that's precisely about how, like, when the telegraph first emerged, or when photography first emerged, people thought that photography is not a electronic tool, but let's say
it's a technical medium,
technical means of reproduction. That essentially these were ways we were going to commune with the dead. Right, that like literally the dead could, one could imagine in the 19th century that somehow, like if you could have a phonograph, like if Edison could make a record of somebody's voice, then you really could hear somebody speaking who was dead, and that was like having a ghost, and like, I don't know, it was weird. It was weird. Like imagine being in the 1800s and suddenly you can hear the voice of a dead person. Like that's weird, right? And so electronic media has always been sort of a little haunted and spooky. And I think this is one of the reasons why, let's say, the larger contemporary art world has maybe struggled with it a little bit as an artistic medium. There's a little bit of suspicion about its truth claims, about its narrative power, and I'm going to use a word here that I find really problematic, but I think it's sort of the elephant in the room. It's spectacular nature, right? This question of spectacle. Yeah. And so for a long time, I think, throughout the 20th century at least, and even into the 21st, let's say, there's a lot of people who are very comfortable with painting and sculpture as artistic media that, create new worlds and all of that. But as soon as you have somebody projecting an image, from a digital file, they get spooked.
I want to ask you about this as a curator, because I remember several years ago I was working on this really weird project and was asking your advice about it, and we're not going to talk about that project, but but you said something really interesting that stuck with me, which is you said, look, museums are weirdly the most trusted civic institutions, and so like there is this paradox where it's like these institutions that are designed to show you fictions essentially, but that are very trusted, and is that, I'm wondering if that is a complexity that you've had to navigate as being like one of the few curators who's embraced digital stuff.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So what Trevor's citing, and I can't believe you remember this, but yeah, the Association of Art Museum Directors, AAMD, conducted a survey, a poll of public opinion. A series of questions were designed to sort of ascertain people's level of trust, and it's like your friends, the mainstream media, museums, and it turns out that museums, which is not only meant art museums, but also museums of natural history and science, et cetera, at least in America, I believe. I don't remember how wide the survey sample was, but I think it was America, were the most trusted source of information. People thought museums speak with a kind of authority, a kind of objectivity, and that they don't bullshit you. And for art museums, that's a kind of interesting position to be in. But I think it is, the wall label, like the art itself can be ambiguous, but the wall label is usually written in this objective third person tone that, seems very authoritative.
Explains what the art is about for you.
Well, one hopes. There's some museum educators would say it actually should not explain what the art is about at all, and should leave that to the viewer. But anyway, that's very spicy debates in the museum education field, and we're not going to get into it. But I think I have to, that's a good question. I'm not sure I have an answer about whether the suspicion towards art and technology, like how that sort of dovetails with the idea that the museum is a trusted space. But certainly the museum is a space in which it's supposed to be a kind of refuge. Like it's always been seen since, let's say, theories of modernism emerged in the 1940s and Clement Greenberg said, look, we have kitsch pop culture and then we have art. Right? So the museum is a space that is a refuge from mass culture. And in mass culture, you're being manipulated by Hollywood films, you're being manipulated by television, but the museum is like different than that, art is different than that. And so this idea of, art is something that is not about that, but is about itself, I really struggled with because I also think art should be of its time and contemporary art should be of its time. But where I'm going with this is that weirdly, I think we've come full circle. And I think what we're seeing with the work that you do, for example, is that your approach to technology is actually really similar to a high modernist approach. You might get angry that I'm saying this, I don't know.
No, I'm with you.
In the same way that Jackson Pollock was exploring the sort of the physical properties of paint and the way that paint can be thrown and dripped, you are exploring, you use the word physical, I think, even to describe, like you're exploring the physics of AI, like how this thing works and why it gets its hooks into us. And so there is this, the word that we use to describe modernism is self-reflexive, that it is an artist who is making work that in some way comments upon the medium or its own conditions of making, right? And like it's the same move, like you're being sort of self-reflexive about these tools. And for me, that's where the criticality, can come in, is that you're using these tools in a really deliberate way and you're trying to figure out how they work. And I think that can be, again, I don't want to be prescriptive, artists can do many different things, but certainly artists working with technology, that's one great service they do to society, I think.
Well, I think that's true. And, I came up in this kind of postmodern moment, right, where all the professors, it was like this, images and copies and nothing, whatever. And I always just felt like that felt really cynical to me, And so like I do take inspiration. I'm not a modernist or whatever, but I take inspiration from that idea of like these are these things we can do. We can take an approach to the world that is like not cynical, I guess, right? And that does actually have a lot of optimism in it, even though like I'm a pretty like dark guy sometimes.
But the idea that you can actually understand these things, that like one can come to know that can work through them, right? Get closer to it. Okay, I don't know if this is totally shifting gears, but it might be. I have a very specific sort of like concrete question, which is that at some point you referred to these models as maybe being like the art themselves. Yeah. And so I wanted to ask you more about like what is the what when it comes to your projects maybe, or maybe to working with AI or even technology more generally. Because this is something that I think the public struggles with, and it's something that curators struggle with. That when certain technological projects, right, they are variable in their manifestations. So like, we don't have it on the screen, but like there's, there might be like the work you just installed in Mexico City, yeah. Right? So that's a version of the image roulette.
That's agnostic of like how it's,
Yeah, okay. But like, so maybe that's a bad example, but like, that the work can sort of exist in different iterations, different formats, different technological, like literally different projectors is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah,
like,
totally, yeah.
Or it can be interactive in one showing and another time it's not interactive, it's just a video capture that you're watching, right? So how do you think about the work that you do? Is it just the conceptual approach? Is it the model itself? If you're working with a model, like, is that the artwork? Like in a really nitty-gritty way, like, would you ever sell the model? I don't know.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, like if like some of those works, like if you buy it, what you get is like a box with like a hard drive in the box and like a set of instructions about like this is what counts, this is what doesn't count, and like hope you have a good digital conservator. But yeah, totally. And we're just like this is the range of things that you can do with it. So so the answer is yes. And so that model is like a crafted object. It doesn't exist in the same physical. Well, kind of does. Like it's still a physical thing. It's like some bits written on, silicon or whatever. But I wanted to flip that back to you because like this is not new. Like Saul LeWitt was doing this, right? And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about like that history of digital arts, that kind of like, nobody made this up, 5 years ago or whatever.
Yeah, okay, well, I want to be cognizant of the time. This is like a whole nother lecture, but I will say there is a certain line of reasoning that says that, digital art is not unique in thinking that, in a certain sense, the instructions are the work of art. And we could literally mean by that the code. Like if Trevor sells you an artwork, he's not selling you a print on a piece of paper in a frame. He's selling you a hard drive with binary code on it, right? And so it's actually the instructions are the work. That has a prehistory, specifically in conceptual art. So if any of you have ever been so fortunate to buy or sell a wall drawing by Sol LeWitt, you don't buy a wall with a drawing on it, right? You buy a piece of paper that's authenticated, that comes with the instructions for how you make the Sol LeWitt wall drawing. Could anybody else just go and make their own Sol LeWitt wall drawing at home? Absolutely, nothing's stopping you. But you only own the Sol LeWitt if you own the piece of paper that's authenticated that says you own the Sol LeWitt. In the same way that anybody could maybe copy the code of one of Trevor's works, but unless you have the certificate of authenticity, you don't actually own the work. And for me, this has always been one of the most beautiful things about code-based art, is this idea that it can be for everybody and yet also be collected, which is to say, reside in like, to be somebody's responsibility, right? To like, somebody has to actually take care and ownership over this thing, right? Although maybe care can be distributed, which is a whole nother question and requires completely reorganizing our cultural organizations and how we think about cultural heritage, and that's another talk. But anyway, Christiana Paul, who's the curator of digital art at the Whitney, did an excellent show in 2018 called Programmed, which was precisely about looking at how we came to think about a work of art as being a program, a series of ideas, rather than a physical object. And the art historian Edward Schenken has also written papers connecting conceptual art to digital art. So yeah, it's a...
And I want to be clear, like I'm not, like I make physical stuff and the physical thing is the artwork too. I just work across a lot of different media and each thing that I make is animated by the ideas that from what it needs to be. Like some things need to be a photograph. No, it's meant to, it is natively photographic for this reason, this and that, and you're not getting a hard drive. But I wanted to, there is kind of going back to what you were said before about almost like this vibes shift, right? Like I kind of feel like a vibes shift in like digital art over the last maybe 5 years that became really visible with the NFT thing, but I think is much bigger than that. And like it feels really different than like the what was that, IZEA conference in the like 1990s or whatever. SIGGRAPH, yeah. And you know that history better than I do. You've spent time in these different moments of it, and I wonder if you can either validate or dispute this vibe shift that I detect in terms of like technology-based art.
So very generally what Trevor's pointing to, and again, I'll try to be brief and cognizant of time, is that basically what we mean by art and technology or by media art, referring to a certain constellation of practices, has had its sort of weird history in terms of its relationship to what we might call mainstream contemporary art. And so sometimes it is shown in the same museums that are showing mainstream painting and sculpture. Sometimes it is sold by galleries that also sell painting and sculpture. But this whole time, it has also been its own parallel art world. So it has had its own set of collectors, its own canon of artists, its own exhibition spaces, its own festivals and awards, and its own economic models. So for a long time, media artists, maybe they weren't selling limited edition artworks or unique artworks to collectors for hundreds of thousands of dollars, but they would go from sort of one festival to another, and they would be commissioned to make work by this festival, and that was how they sort of made a living, in the same way that many artists now are sort of biennial artists as opposed to blue chip commercial artists. And so the history of media art, it's not necessarily, despite it being quite deep, it's not necessarily something that's known to those of us, and I identify as somebody who comes from the mainstream contemporary art world. It's not necessarily something that's known to those of us in the mainstream contemporary art world. As Trevor said, it sort of cohered around things like computer graphics conferences, SIGGRAPH, or ICEA, which is an Association for Electronic Arts. These are sort of specialized communities. Certainly, since I became a professional 20 plus years ago, interested in working with media art, more and more mainstream spaces have been interested in media art. It is a kind of fad, as I said. It's like in 2016, everyone wanted a VR project. And then in 2017, everyone wanted an AR project. And then you never saw them again, right? And so I've just learned, I think a lot of people in the media arts community are really burned by that. And from where I sit, it's like the same thing can be said of like figurative painting or whatever. Like these things always go, everything goes in cycles in the art world to the extent that we're talking about a market, because markets are driven by fads, Definitely with the NFT thing, it felt for once like there was a sort of, that the power dynamics had shifted a little bit. And suddenly this media art community had a lot of attention and a lot of money, and was sort of something that now the mainstream art world was suddenly looking to and trying to figure out what's going on with that. And then, of course, the market for NFTs sort of collapsed and all of that. But what I'm hoping will be the long-term sort of consequence of that, the vibe shift, is that more and more mainstream institutions, collectors, galleries, art historians, writers, et cetera, will start to understand that, digital art, let's say, as a subset of art and technology, is something that is legitimate, is something that is an absolutely crucial part of contemporary art and is here to stay. And I think I've seen this, again, in the course of my 20 years. It's like, we reached a certain point 10 years ago. It was like, oh, every blue chip gallery has one digital artist. They only need one, but they also only have one landscape painter, and they only have one, black figurative painter or whatever, But it was like, oh, everybody has their one, And I feel like, that's just like one silly sort of arbitrary marker, but I do feel like there's more and more acceptance, and I sort of think it's inevitable. I've said for a long time that there is no modern art without media art, if you look back at the history of the 20th century, and there's also no contemporary art without media art, because as Lillian said in her introduction, there is no aspect of contemporary life that's not touched upon by digital technologies. And if contemporary art is the art of our time, how do you talk about our time if you're not also talking about technology? And this is not to say that you can't still make still life paintings. That's fine. I don't want anyone to panic. But one would think that a general contemporary art program, whether it's a commercial gallery or a museum, et cetera, or an art school, that part of that, digital art has to be part of that conversation, is the vibe shift that I see. I just think it's an inevitability at this point. But what I'm hoping is that, and part of the reason I'm so glad we were able to have this talk tonight is that people understand that actually digital art can take very many different formats, and it can ask really tough questions about these technologies and about how they're used, about the bias built into data sets, et cetera, and that it's not just all about making pretty wallpaper. Although again, nobody panic. If you make pretty wallpaper, that might be okay too. But yeah, so. Do we want to take some questions for the audience? I don't know if there's in the final few moments, if anybody has any questions. I think we're supposed to wait. Paul has a microphone, and perhaps a colleague as well.
Hi, everyone. Hello. Yes. Hi, my colleague Fiona and I will be bringing microphones up and down the alleys on both sides. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. We're going to be bringing microphones up and down the alleys on both sides, so please put your hands up, and then we'll bring you microphones so you can answer your questions. We have one question right here. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for this very wide-ranging conversation, one that clearly talked to the ethics and of the media information age and what algorithms are doing to information as well as art. So I naively have a question about art. So is all art necessarily immersive? And that spans the technology and the media. So we have the Virgin, the Dynamo, the sensor, the algorithm. But then to is is the what about the interaction of the algorithm and the data set? Should the word simulation be used much more often? Should it be simulated intelligent, not artificial intelligent? It removes the A. I'm sure everyone who thought of the term liked the A right there, because they're working in the field. But simulated intelligence and simulated creativity, because there's no consciousness. So 2 questions.
I'll try to answer them in brief. So for the first one, I'm just gonna, so the question being, isn't all art immersive? I will just share, and I'm so sorry as an editor, I really should remember the writer's name, and I don't remember right now, but somebody wrote, you guys familiar with the concept of like the Van Gogh light show? I'm sure they've come to Montreal as well, right? So there's these like spectacular things, and you pay an exorbitant, far more than a museum ticket costs to go in and like see blown up digital reproductions of Van Gogh paintings, right? That are like animated, and maybe there's some music. And again, I mean, I've got a lot to say about these, as you might imagine, as somebody who loves digital art, but also is a classically trained art historian who minored in 19th century painting. But somebody wrote in the New York Times about the Van Gogh light show phenomenon, and they said, and I'm just paraphrasing, it was so beautifully put, but if you thought that Van Gogh's paintings were not already animated, you've never actually seen them. And then to the second question about simulated, again, I would just point you to that Sonia Drimmer essay that we published in Art Forum, where she really critiques that, even the language, like calling it artificial intelligence, is basically a marketing ploy. And it is language that is designed to make us believe that this technology is sort of more powerful than it is, and also that it has a kind of agency, which then, of course, absolves the agency of the people who created it. But Trevor, maybe you have other thoughts?
No, I mean, it was literally invented by a guy as a marketing term to raise money.
We have another question over here.
Hi. In the early 80s, artist in Winnipeg, Jeff Fennell, gave us a kind of vision into the future, and he said, he was presenting some of his videos at a small artist-run center. He said, one day, everyone will be a video artist. And I'm wondering, what does it do to art now that the means of production and the means of distribution are so widely available? So where does art fit now in that? I think for me, it creates a quandary.
Yeah, sure. So again, this is like a whole nother thing. Art with a capital A, what is it anyway? So I think one thing that we've been struggling in terms of the vibe shift, right? Now that the sort of means of production are in more people's hands, and also the modes of distribution are in more people's hands, I think we are sort of collectively struggling to come up with language to describe all of this output and all of these experiences. To be clear, because I know I'm about to sound incredibly elitist, like one of the reasons I love media art is because of the utopianism of the sort of earlier generations. Like, so much early video art was made by women and by people of color, people who historically had been excluded from occupying the subject position of important artist with a capital A. And I think that's great. I love the egalitarian impulse of media art. So I'm not against that in any way. I think that the more that we see, I'm about to use the C word, content shared, the more we're sort of struggling to figure out what the line is between fine art, content, design, and maybe something else, meme culture, et cetera. And I do not want, again, I'm just always very self-conscious, partly because of my position of authority within the mainstream contemporary art world, and partly because of my politics. I don't want to imply a kind of hierarchy. Like, one of my degrees that Lillian mentioned is in visual studies. Like, I think visual culture is really important and no less valuable than fine art with a capital A, right? But I do think it's different, right? These things circulate in different spaces. They address a different set of questions. They are cognizant of different histories. And I do think it's important to sort of not just have everything flood the zone with like, you know? And so how do we hold on to the specificity of the discourse around art or around aesthetics in a way where we're constantly being reflexive about basically the power, right? The systems of power and privilege that are encoded in all of that. And that's the life's work, you know.
We have a question in the front here.
Thank you so much for that amazingly informative and interesting talk. Both of you referenced in your own way the kind of epistemological crisis that we're living in at this moment, and simultaneously look back to kind of point to the history of earlier epistemological crises or kind of fundamental paradigm shifts, whether it's Renaissance perspective or the invention of photography. And being a 19th century scholar myself, so much of what you're saying links back to me directly to the moment of the invention of photography, when images were much more easily made than, let's say, making a painting, much more widely distributed, and when there was a fundamental questioning of, you know, the limits of human perception. How can we tell what's real or not? Is this art or not? So I'd love to hear from both of you. In what ways is what we're living now fundamentally different?
I'll take a crack at it. I don't know. Okay, this is just me just reckoning shit. Like, I'm not a 19th century scholar. I don't know anything. But okay, so I'll just say vibe of photography. It sort of comports with like the vibe of the Enlightenment, in the sense that, like, here's a thing, you can make a representation of it, and we're going to assume that it has some kind of fidelity to nature, broadly understood. That it has something to do with, I mean, I'm not going to use the word objectivity, have you. Of course you have spirit photography. Of course you have UFO photography, right? But like, it creates a kind of media a priori that, like, if there's a photograph that of, you know, the army abusing prisoners in Abu Ghraib prison, that probably happened, right? The photograph of the napalm girl, like, that happened, right? And so like, I'm not even saying like that specific photograph told the truth or what have you, but that is a kind of a common sense about what photos are, even when photos aren't that, right? I feel like that common sense, or like that a priori, now is broken. And that's not to say that, like, photographs still can't provide evidence. I mean, all this stuff in Minnesota with ICE, you know, stuff going on in the Middle East. I mean, that documentation is enormously important in terms of trying to create these truths. But on the other hand, you do have this, I'm going to use the word demonic, for lack of a better word, of these other kinds of visual culture that are creating images and creative forms of media that are incredibly predatory on the parts of your cognitive system that are not reasonable, right? That, like, bypass your ability to reason about them, to just trigger fear, or trigger desire, trigger whatever it is, that are treating you as if you were an algorithm that could be, you know, poked and prodded in different kinds of ways. And I feel like that kind of thing has been around forever, but that has been institutionalized in such a way through things like, you know, recommendation algorithms, curated feeds, what have you, that becomes so much of what your sensorium is, that I do think it adds up to a kind of epistemological and, like, even like metaphysical kind of break that I worry is, like, not really consonant with the Enlightenment, which you kind of need if you're going to have democracy, at least the way that we understand it now.
Oh boy. You know, the field of media studies is, like, plagued by this question of, like, how much is new in new media? There's actually a great anthology called New Media, Old Media that was precisely about this. Mia Feynman at the Metropolitan Museum of Art did a show a number of years ago called Faking It, which was precisely about the, like, very analog proto-history of doctored photographic images, to basically point out that, like, we think of photography as being this like objective, it's the pencil of nature, you know, it's truth-based, and now we live in this like post-modernist, you know, morass of photoshopped altered imagery. And she's like, no, people were doctoring their negatives, like, you know, and doing double exposures and all of that since the very beginning.
But she had to point that out.
But she had to point that out. She had to point that out. So on the one hand, I'm like, it's totally the same, in the sense that like the image has always been a contested thing, and it's always been about like how do we define what is plausible, what looks. By the way, I keep on harping on this because there is an issue, there is an essay in the March issue of Artforum, which is about to hit the newsstands, which is precisely about mimesis and generative AI, and going back to like Platonic aesthetic theory. I was super happy when you mentioned that earlier. You're like, this is the Platonic ideal. So there's actually an essay on that. So on the one hand, it's like, it's all the same. On the other hand, just short story, there are many people who have argued that once you shift from a lens-based model of photography to a computational model of photography, it actually is a profound rupture, because you have, in some really material way, totally ruptured the connection to any kind of physical reality. And I think we're all working through that, right? It's like a little bit the same and a little bit different. And also, these things are all hybrid. There's really very few images that are purely computational or purely lens-based. It's like all a bit of a mess. But thank God we have artists like Trevor to help us through it. So
Confused, right?
yeah.
Yeah. Oops, sorry. I think we have one question in the middle over here.
Thanks for the great discussion, guys. I had a question about sort of the general and animosity I've seen towards generative AI art. The best example of the animosity I'm talking about is something that happened 2 weeks ago to my girlfriend. So we were out at a bar, and a really good R&B song came on. And so she Shazammed it and then made a note. And then like the next morning, I get a text, and she's like, oh my God, it was a AI artist, that song I like so much. He sent a screenshot, and there was like a Spotify ghost, you know, artist. And I kind of questioned her. I'm like, okay, you like the song. What's the big deal, right? I mean, I'm biased from what I do, but I was curious if you think this kind of animosity is unique towards this medium of art, and if you think it's here to stay. So yeah.
You got a deep bench on this one.
If you go back, like, so the art historian Grant D. Taylor wrote a book called When the Machines Made Art, that's about the sort of first generation of digital artists in the 1960s. And like, people got violent at their shows. Like, people were throwing vegetables, like, I mean, there has been so much anger towards artists who work with computers for like half a century now. And I think that part of it has to do with how the computer is understood as something that is anti-humanist, that is fundamentally opposed to all of the values that we associate with art about, you know, creativity and, you know, a life well lived and all of that. It's this cold, soulless machine, especially with AI. We also have to talk about the ecological extractivism. We have to talk about the systemic bias. We have to talk about the economic extraction with, you know, violation of people's intellectual property rights, like on and on and on and on. And I think that artists, you know, on the one hand, we need to be asking these tough questions if we want to work with these technologies, right? But if I'm going to be spicy for a second, it certainly would be nice if the same people who demand that digital artists are accountable for every single social and political consequence of the tools that they use would be consistent and would also demand the same from painters and sculptors and photographers and illustrators. I mean, as I like to point out, like, you know, paint is not a net neutral tool either. Like, paint, it requires the extraction of pigments, and also, like, you know, the history of painting is like deeply implicated in the colonial project.
Don't even worry about IG Farben.
But really, like, cadmium blue is like so. I mean, these things, like, pigments have a colonial history. Like, I mean, so it's like I'm not trying to be a whataboutism kind of thing and say like, oh well, it doesn't matter. I'm just saying it does matter. But like the expectations that we put upon artists using computers in specific it does feel like it's driven by a sort of larger, like, cultural vendetta, misunderstanding, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what gets lost in the sauce a little bit is your girlfriend's experience, which is that these things do trigger an aesthetic experience. I have an essay coming out in a sort of handbook of digital art where there's various sort of encyclopedic entries for different words, and I wrote the entry on aesthetics. And I open with talking about a computer-generated plotter print that made me cry, because I just want to remind people that, like, robots can make you cry. You don't, always need, anyway. I mean, the drawings of Michelangelo also make me cry. Frankly, everything makes me cry. I love art, so it's one of the reasons why I do what I do. How do we deal with that? And again, I don't have an easy answer, but this is what we're here to do, right? Is to think through these questions. But yes, the hatred is very real. And I do feel like part of it is, I'm just very contrarian. And whenever there's a pile on, I just want to take the other position.
Well, I mean, like, for me to be like, to have like a stupid reaction to that, like, what if I'm like, well, you know what, AI is gonna oppress us, right? And it is gonna take people's jobs, and it is like, like in your everyday experience of it, yeah, like you might make a bigger thing, but there's an anxiety that, like, this is a tool of capital that is encroaching into yet another place where we thought we could just be left alone and be like squishy little humans and happy, and I don't know.
I guess for me, the thing that I don't like about the anxiety is that I think, and I talked about this in one of my editor's letters recently, actually for the current issue, about nihilism. I can't truck with it, and I think that this idea, like the anxiety, I think is sort of self-defeating because it gets you into a position of paralysis and feeling like, AI is going to destroy everything. And I'm like, that's AI's marketing copy. Like, if you believe AI has the power to destroy everything, then you have just been hoodwinked by tech bros. Like, it doesn't have that power, right? It's not like the famous...
It does have the power to, like, automate a fulfillment center and, like, make people's lives horrible. Like,
but that's not the AI. That's the government. Like, that's the lack of regulation. That's like...
okay, fair enough.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like, that's like, you know what I mean? Like, the technological systems, like, I don't believe all technologies are neutral, but I'm also not a technological determinist. And I just think that, like, we just have to be really deliberate and careful about how we use these things. And that means you have to understand them. And this is why I think artists, can be so useful, right? Is like helping us develop the language and the sensitivity. Everything, I joked earlier about not being a math person. Like, I work in technology. I've never taken a coding class in my life. Every single thing I know about computers, I learned from artists.
Mic drop.
I think that our time is just about up, so maybe we'll take a last question from Fiona, who I think has someone lined up.
I did have someone who was ready over here.
Hi.
What's up, big dog?
Hello.
Hi, Rafa.
So you guys I want to pile on the hatred because it's well deserved. So I think that you are both representative of a media arts that is critical, that is engaged with politics, with society, with economics, with history, and you're atypical. So just taking a devil's advocate position, is there also an argument that there is too much digital art entering the space? And the example of Spotify is a good one because it's entering and displacing other artists who are doing substantial work, say in music or whatever. Is that also happening in the visual arts, right? Is there a degree to which a lot of the generative work is not just the cultural logic of, techno-oligarchic optimism, right? And I know that both of you are not techno-optimists, but I do think that that's important to underline, that you guys are weird and unique in the sense that you're talking about technology, but in a way that is looking at the meta layers. And the truth is maybe our schools are teaching too much techno-optimism, and people think that this is going to make them huge and whatever, but they're not really studying the history or anything that you guys have basically covered. So I just wanted to sort of take that position. So just, can you destroy techno-optimism for us?
I want to just say, I called this guy Big Dog because this is Raphael Lozano-Hemmer, who's one of the, is a incredible artist based here in Montreal and really one of the luminaries in this field. So I realize that may have sounded like really weird when I said that. But I'll leave that. Why don't you take that question?
I'm not a techno-optimist. I'm not, but I also don't want to be, I don't want to say not a techno-pessimist, but I just don't want to give in to this idea of the invincibility of it, right? I don't want to give it that kind of power, those kinds of narrative structures around technology. I will say, again, this is a much bigger conversation, but what I can think of right now at the end of a long conversation that has been very taxing, because you guys are all very smart and you're asking great questions and Trevor's work is amazing, is fine. But like we can say, like, oh yeah, there's a lot of digital artists who are not working very critically with their tools and who are, perhaps being a bit naive and et cetera, and maybe a lot of the art is bad. But like, have you been to an art fair? There's also a lot of really bad painting. So again, it's fine, let's have standards, but let's just be consistent in the application. All right, that was supposed to be our final question, so now I'm realizing, we'll say our final, thank you, Trevor.
Thank you, this is amazing.
Thank you.
I always love talking to you
It's
so
fun
much.
to do it in front of an audience for once. Thank you guys for coming.